The most chilling death row executions, last meals, final words, and unforgivable crimes between 1992 and 1995. These 7 men were executed for crimes that shocked the nation and left a chilling legacy. From Harris's return to California's gas chamber to Mason's silent refusal of appeals and Grasso's bizarre last complaint, these final acts stood out for their brutality, strange rituals, and haunting goodbyes. In this story, we examine who they were, the brutal crimes they committed, their last meals, and the haunting last words they chose before facing death. 9. Robert Alton Harris. In July 1978, Robert Alton Harris and his younger brother carried out a brutal double murder that left San Diego shaken. They abducted 2 16-year-old boys from outside a fast food restaurant, forced them into a stolen vehicle, and drove to a secluded area. The victims, John Meidsky and Michael Baker, were friends simply looking to grab a burger. They had just finished their shift at a local Jack-in-the-Box and were planning to go fishing the next day. Their lives were cut short for the most senseless of reasons. Harris wanted their car to use as a getaway vehicle for a bank robbery he planned to commit later that day. Before he shot them, Harris finished the half-eaten hamburgers the boys had left in their car, a detail so cold and detached that it would later become a defining image of his utter lack of empathy. There, Harris shot both teenagers without pause, leaving no chance for survival. The crime stunned the city, and the grief spread far beyond the victims' families. Harris was quickly arrested, and after a lengthy trial followed by years of appeals, he received a death sentence. He remained on death row for the next 13 years. The key to his capture was his brother Daniel. After carrying out the bank robbery, the 2 brothers were apprehended. While in custody, Daniel, who had been a reluctant accomplice, confessed to his role and implicated Robert as the triggerman. His testimony became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, painting a damning picture of a man who killed for convenience and treated human life as an afterthought. This betrayal from his blood sealed Robert's fate, ensuring he would face the full force of the law for the murders of Meidsky and Baker. During his appeals, Harris's defense team brought to light a deeply troubled past. Born prematurely after his mother was kicked in the stomach by his abusive father, Harris suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome. His childhood was a relentless cycle of neglect and violence, moving between foster homes where he was frequently beaten and tormented. While these facts offered a tragic context for the man he became, they did little to sway the courts or the public. The brutality of his crimes overshadowed any sympathy his history might have garnered, and the legal system ultimately concluded that his past, however horrific, did not absolve him of his choices. Robert Alton Harris was the first person executed after California reinstated the death penalty. In his final hours, he requested a last meal of KFC pizza, jelly beans, Pepsi, ice cream, and cigarettes, though he was not allowed to smoke. He offered a slice of pizza to the warden. His execution faced for last-minute stays. Twice, he was strapped into the gas chamber, only to be pulled out and returned to his cell. The U.S. Supreme Court denied the final legal challenge. On April 21, 1992, at 6:07 a.m., gas was released. At 6:14, he was declared dead. His last words were, "Everyone dances with the Grim Reaper." 8. Roger Keith Coleman. In March 1981, Grundy, Virginia, was rocked by the brutal R**pay and murder of Wanda Faye McCoy. Her brother-in-law, Roger Keith Coleman, was convicted and sentenced to death. For over a decade, he claimed innocence. Wanda McCoy was found in her home, her throat slit so deeply she was nearly decapitated. She had been stabbed multiple times and sexually assaulted. The crime scene was horrific, and in the small, tight mining community of Grundy, suspicion quickly fell on Coleman, who had a prior conviction for attempted rape. He had been staying at a home nearby and had access to the victim's house. The community's fear and outrage demanded a swift resolution, and Coleman, with his criminal record, became the immediate and sole focus of the investigation. As his execution neared, national media questioned the case. Citing police misconduct and biased jurors, Coleman became a symbol of possible injustice, fueling widespread debate about the fallibility of the death penalty. The prosecution's case rested on what appeared to be solid forensic evidence. A fingerprint found at the scene was said to match. Coleman's and hairs found on the victim were consistent with his. Semen was also discovered, which, according to the science of the time, did not exclude him as the perpetrator. However, Coleman's advocates argued that the evidence was mishandled and that his court-appointed lawyers had been incompetent, failing to challenge the forensic findings or investigate other potential suspects. These claims gained traction, and Coleman was eventually featured on the cover of Time magazine, turning his case into a national referendum on capital punishment. Just hours before his scheduled execution, a last-minute decision brought him into a private room for a polygraph test, arranged secretly by Governor Douglas Wilder. However, when the results came back, the test did not support his claims. For many, that ended the fight. For others, it raised even more questions in the hours that followed. Coleman sat down for his last meal, cold pizza, shared in silence with James McCloskey of Centurion Ministries. the man who had believed in his innocence since 1988. There were no final celebrations, only quiet moments between two men who had run out of time. On May 20, 1992, Keith Coleman was executed in the electric chair at Greensville Correctional Center. His final words were, "An innocent man is going to be murdered tonight." In 2006, DNA testing confirmed that semen found on Wanda McCoy matched Coleman's profile. His claims of innocence were proven false. Wesley Allen Dodd, 1989. Wesley Allen Dodd confessed to murdering 3 boys, documenting the acts in a diary and photos. He warned he would kill again unless executed. The boys he murdered were brothers, 10-year-old Cole and 11-year-old William Nair and 4-year-old Lee Isley. Dodd was a predator who meticulously planned his attacks, often luring children with a friendly demeanor and promises of toys or games. His diary was not just a confession, but a chilling chronicle of his twisted fantasies and a detailed procedural of his crimes. It revealed a man who took immense pleasure in the suffering of others and who viewed his victims as objects for his gratification. The discovery of this journal and accompanying photographs left no room for doubt and provided a terrifying window into the mind of a monster. Convicted and unrepentant, he requested hanging, the same method he used on a victim. The court granted it without delay, ending his life. Dodd's capture came after a failed abduction attempt. He tried to lure a 6-year-old boy from a movie theater restroom, but the child screamed and fought back, attracting attention. Dodd fled, but was later identified and arrested. It was during his interrogation for this attempted kidnapping that he began confessing to the murders of the Nair brothers and Lee Isley, shocking investigators with his calm and detailed recollections. Had that 6-year-old boy not resisted, Dodd's reign of terror could have continued indefinitely, his dark secrets remaining buried along with his victims. His insistence on being hanged was a source of great controversy. It was a method of execution that had fallen out of use in the United States for nearly 3 decades. Washington state law allowed inmates to choose between lethal injection and hanging, and Dodd's choice forced the state to construct a new gallows specifically for him. He claimed he chose hanging because it was how he had killed one of his victims, and he felt it was a fitting, even just end. Critics, however, saw it as his final act of control, a way to sensationalize his death and once again place himself at the center of a horrific spectacle. On January 5, 1993, Wesley Allen Dodd was executed by hanging at Walla Walla State Penitentiary. His last meal was broiled salmon with fried potatoes. His final words were, "I was once asked if there was any way ex-offenders could be stopped. I said no, I was wrong." The families of his victims attended the execution. Some later described feeling a sense of closure. 6. Leonel Herrera. In the early 1980s, the streets of South Texas were rocked by the murders of 2 police officers. Leonel Herrera was arrested and convicted of the crime in 1982. The 2 officers were killed in separate but related incidents on the night of September 29, 1981. The first officer, David Rucker of the Texas Department of Public Safety, was found shot on a rural highway after a traffic stop. Shortly after, Officer Enrique Carrizales of the nearby city of Edinburgh pulled over a vehicle matching the description of the one seen at Rucker's murder scene. As Carrizales approached the car, the driver opened fire, wounding him fatally. Carrizales, before he died, managed to identify his shooter as Leonel Herrera for over a decade. He sat on death row repeating the exact words to anyone who would listen. He had not pulled the trigger. At first, few believed him. However, as the years passed, that certainty began to fade. The initial case against Herrera seemed strong. Besides Officer Carrizales' dying declaration, a damning piece of physical evidence was discovered near Rucker's body, a wallet containing Leonel Herrera's social security card. His girlfriend also provided testimony implicating him for the jury. The combination of a dying officer's identification and physical evidence at the scene was more than enough to secure a conviction and a death sentence. For years, the case seemed closed. Another tragic but straightforward story of violence against law enforcement. New affidavits claimed another man, possibly Herrera's brother, had confessed to the murders. These sworn statements raised serious doubts about Herrera's guilt. The new evidence emerged years after the trial. An affidavit from an attorney claimed that Raul Herrera Sr., Leonel's now deceased brother and a former police officer himself, had confessed to the murders. This was followed by another affidavit from Raul Herrera Jr., Leonel's nephew, who claimed he had witnessed his father commit the killings. However, prosecutors attacked the credibility of these late-game confessions, suggesting they were a desperate, coordinated attempt by the family to save Leonel from execution, conveniently blaming a man who was no longer alive to confirm or deny the story. His legal team took the case to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1993. The justices heard Herrera v. Collins and considered one question: should new evidence of innocence stop an execution? The court ruled against him without a constitutional violation. Innocence alone would not be enough. The Supreme Court's 6-3 decision was a landmark moment in capital jurisprudence. The majority opinion, written by Chief Justice William Rehnquist, stated that a claim of actual innocence based on newly discovered evidence was not, in itself, a basis for federal habeas corpus relief. The court argued that the proper avenue for such claims was executive clemency from the state governor, not a federal retrial. This ruling effectively created a terrifying legal paradox. A person could be factually innocent, but constitutionally eligible for execution because their trial had been deemed fair at the time. On May 12, 1993, Leonel Herrera was executed in Texas. He declined a last meal. His final words were, "I am innocent, I owe society nothing, I am ready." His case became known for raising questions about how new evidence of innocence is handled after trial. 5. David Mason. David Edwin Mason was no stranger to cruelty. Between 1980 and 1982, he stalked the quiet streets of Oakland, California, targeting elderly victims. He entered their homes and, in some cases, used an ice pick to end their lives. Authorities connected him to at least 4 brutal killings, though the real number may have been higher. He showed no remorse and no hesitation, earning the label of a cold-blooded serial killer. His method was consistent and terrifying. He would target elderly individuals living alone, gain entry to their homes through subterfuge or force, and then rob them. The violence that followed was often extreme and unnecessary for the robbery itself. He would strangle his victims, sometimes with their own clothing, and in several cases, he used an ice pick to stab them repeatedly, a signature that made the crimes particularly gruesome and identifiable. Mason was already a career criminal and was on parole when he committed these murders. His extensive criminal record dated back to his youth and included convictions for burglary and assault. He had spent a significant portion of his adult life in and out of the prison system. The murders represented a shocking escalation in his violent behavior. Still, they were the culmination of a life defined by a complete disregard for the law and the well-being of others. The system that had repeatedly released him back into society was now faced with the devastating consequences of that decision. David Mason spent years navigating appeals like many on death row, but then he made a chilling choice. He ended all efforts to delay his execution, declaring he was ready to die. This made him the last California inmate to waive legal protections voluntarily. His decision to drop his appeals was a deliberate one. In letters and statements, Mason expressed profound weariness with life behind bars. He described the endless cycle of appeals as a form of torture and stated that he would rather face death than spend the rest of his days in a cell on death row. "I am guilty," he wrote in one letter. "I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve any. I did the crime and I'll do the time." His acceptance of his fate was not framed as remorse for his victims, but rather as a personal choice to end his suffering on his terms. On August 24, 1993, Mason entered San Quentin's gas chamber, marking the state's final use of the method. He refused a traditional last meal, requesting only ice water, when offered the chance to make a final statement. Mason declined to say anything beyond the brief words, "No, Warden, I want to proceed. Thank you, Warden." At 12:09 a.m., the gas was released. 14 minutes later, he was dead. His quiet end contrasted sharply with the violence of his past. The procedure itself was a relic of a bygone era. 2 chemicals, potassium cyanide pellets and sulfuric acid, were kept in separate compartments beneath the chair. When the warden gave the signal, a lever was pulled, causing the cyanide to drop into the acid. This created a cloud of lethal hydrocyanic gas that rose into the sealed chamber. Witnesses reported that Mason took several deep breaths as the gas filled the room, then convulsed violently for several minutes before his body went limp. The prolonged and visibly painful nature of his death reinforced the arguments against the gas chamber, solidifying its reputation as a cruel method of execution. There were no dramatic speeches or pleas, only silence and the hiss of fumes. His quiet death marked the end of an era, as California would never again use this method of execution. 4. Thomas Grasso. Thomas Grasso murdered 2 older adults in 1990. His first victim, an 87-year-old woman in Tulsa, was strangled with her own Christmas tree lights. 6 months later, he murdered an 81-year-old man in Staten Island while stealing his Social Security check. The victims, Hilda Johnson in Tulsa and Leslie Holtz in Staten Island, were targeted for their vulnerability. Grasso knew Johnson, having done odd jobs for her. He took advantage of her trust to gain entry into her home, where he strangled her and stole what little valuables he could find. With Holtz, he was even more brazen. He followed the older man at home after he cashed his Social Security check, forced his way inside, and murdered him for the cash. The crimes were not acts of passion but predatory strikes driven by a desperate and lazy desire for easy money. He showed little remorse throughout his trial and sentencing, ultimately receiving the death penalty in Oklahoma. Grasso's capture was a result of his carelessness. After murdering Leslie Holtz in New York, he was quickly identified as a suspect and arrested. It was while he was in custody in New York that investigators linked him to the unsolved murder of Hilda Johnson in Oklahoma. This led to a peculiar jurisdictional dispute. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in New York but was also facing the death penalty in Oklahoma. In an unusual agreement, the New York Governor Mario Cuomo, a staunch opponent of the death penalty, agreed to extradite Grasso to Oklahoma to be executed, a decision that drew both praise from victims' rights advocates and criticism from anti-death penalty groups. In March 1995, as his execution neared, Thomas Grasso drew headlines for something strange. His final meal was specific, with steamed mussels, a Burger King double cheeseburger, a mango milkshake, and a can of spaghetti. The prison gave him spaghetti instead. That detail became the focus of his last words. "I did not get my SpaghettiOs, I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." On March 20th at 12:22 a.m., Thomas Grasso was executed by lethal injection in Oklahoma. In his final statement, he complained about receiving spaghetti instead of spaghetti. Instead of SpaghettiOs, he made no apology and did not mention his victims. His last words were, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs, I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." 3. Richard Wayne Snell was no ordinary criminal. He was a violent white supremacist who belonged to extremist groups like the Covenant, the Sword and the Arm of the Lord. The Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord, CSA, was a radical Christian identity militia group based on a fortified compound in northern Arkansas. Its members believed that white Anglo-Saxons were the true chosen people of God and that Jews and people of color were subhuman. They actively trained for a coming race war, stockpiling illegal weapons, explosives, and cyanide. Snell was a devout follower of this ideology, viewing his violent acts not as crimes, but as righteous blows against what he called the Zionist-occupied government. In 1983, he murdered a pawn shop owner, believing he was Jewish. Authorities later connected him to the earlier killing of a black Arkansas state trooper. His crimes were driven by deep hatred and conspiracy-fueled ideology, not personal grievance. His first victim, in 1981, was Arkansas State Trooper Louis P. Bryant, whom Snell shot and killed during a traffic stop. The case went cold for years. His second known victim, in 1983, was William Stump, a pawn shop owner in Texarkana whom Snell mistakenly believed was Jewish. Snell shot Stump to death during a robbery intended to fund the CSA's activities. It wasn't until a major federal siege of the CSA compound in 1985 that authorities uncovered the evidence, including the murder weapon, that definitively linked Snell to both killings. Snell believed he was part of a holy war. During his trial, he preached racial revolution and claimed the government was illegitimate. He never apologized for the murders, and while awaiting execution, he issued dire warnings to the press about violence to come. On April 19, 1995, just hours before he was executed by lethal injection, a bomb destroyed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The coincidence was chilling. Snell had reportedly predicted that date as significant in letters written before his death. Richard Snell was executed on April 19, 1995, the same date as the end of the 1993 Waco siege and the anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord. In 1983, Snell had plotted to bomb the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building as he was being prepared for execution. News coverage of the Oklahoma City bombing aired on a television inside the death house. Witnesses reported that Snell watched the footage, smiled and nodded. Richard Wayne Snell, the white supremacist executed in Arkansas on April 19, 1995, requested hush puppies and fried crappies as his final meal. His final words included praise for his faith and a cryptic reference to future vengeance. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of guilt. Instead, Snell used his final breath to reaffirm the same hatred that had fueled his crimes. His execution closed one case, yet echoed into another. 2. John Wayne Gacy. Few names in the annals of American crime evoke as much horror as John Wayne Gacy to his suburban Chicago community. He was a model citizen, a successful contractor, Democratic precinct captain, and a beloved volunteer who entertained children at parties and hospitals as Pogo the Clown. But beneath the painted smile and friendly demeanor lurked a predator of unimaginable cruelty. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy lured at least 33 teenage boys and young men to his home with promises of construction work or drugs, where he would subject them to unspeakable torture before strangling them with a rope tourniquet. The horrifying truth of his double life was unearthed in December 1978, when investigators, searching for a missing 15-year-old boy last seen with Gacy, were met with a foul odor emanating from a crawlspace beneath his house. What they found was a mass grave. 29 bodies were unearthed from the crawlspace and other areas of his property, while 4 more were recovered from the Des Plaines River. The sheer scale of the carnage was staggering, transforming a quiet neighborhood street into the site of one of the most horrific discoveries in U.S. history. Gacy was arrested, and the image of the smiling party clown was forever shattered, replaced by the vacant stare of a remorseless serial killer. Throughout his trial, Gacy displayed a chilling arrogance. He showed no remorse, flippantly blaming the victims and offering a ludicrous defense that the deaths were the result of autoerotic asphyxiation gone wrong. The jury saw through the lies and he was convicted of 33 murders and sentenced to death. For the next 14 years on death row, Gacy reveled in his infamy, corresponding with criminologists and selling his disturbing paintings of clowns and skulls. Becoming a grotesque caricature of a celebrity killer, he never took responsibility, maintaining a facade of victimhood until the very end. On May 10, 1994, the time for performance was over. For his last meal, Gacy requested fried shrimp, French fries, and a pound of strawberries, a final nod to his past life as a manager for several KFC restaurants. When asked for his last words, he offered none of the apologies or pleas for forgiveness that often mark a final statement. Instead, as the executioners prepared the lethal injection, spat out his final, defiant insult to the world, "Kiss my ass," as the lethal drugs were administered during John Wayne Gacy's execution. The chemicals solidified in the intravenous tube and blocked the flow. The execution was paused, and a curtain was drawn while staff replaced the clogged line. After a 10-minute delay, the process resumed. Gacy was pronounced dead at 12:58 a.m. 1 Harold Lamont Oaty on September 2, 1994. The state of Nebraska prepared to do something it hadn't done in 36 years: execute a prisoner. The man at the center of this grim revival was Harold Lamont Oaty, a killer whose crime had haunted the city of Omaha for nearly 2 decades. In 1977, Oaty broke into the apartment of 26-year-old Jane McManus, a budding photographer. He raped her, brutally beat her, and stabbed her to death. The crime was a senseless and savage act of violence that left the community reeling and set in motion a legal battle that would span 17 years. Oaty was swiftly convicted and sentenced to die, but a long and tortuous appeals process delayed his execution. His case became a focal point for the national debate over capital punishment, as Nebraska's long-dormant death penalty faced intense legal and moral scrutiny. For years he lived on death row, a symbol of a sentence that existed on the books but seemed to have been left in the past. As his appeals ran out, the state was forced to confront the reality of its law. The electric chair, nicknamed Old Sparky, was dusted off and tested, and a date was set. The impending execution turned the Nebraska State Penitentiary into a charged battleground. Outside the prison walls, hundreds of protesters gathered, holding candles and singing hymns in a vigil against the state-sanctioned killing. Inside, Oaty prepared for his end with a strange sense of calm. He ordered a lavish last meal of a T-bone, steak, lobster tail, fried mushrooms, onion rings, and a pint of chocolate chip ice cream, a final feast before the famine of eternity. When the moment arrived, Oaty was strapped into the imposing wooden chair. When asked if he had any last words, he looked towards the witnesses and delivered a statement that was not an apology or a plea, but a phrase of unnerving, casual finality. "Ain't nothing to it but to do it," he said. "Let's do it." The words hung in the air, a shockingly nonchalant farewell from a man facing a violent death. His blaze attitude seemed to mock the gravity of the occasion, treating his execution as little more than a necessary chore. Moments later, 2,450 volts of electricity surged through his body. His death was swift, but his final words lingered, a chilling testament to a man who faced the ultimate consequence with a shrug. But were those final words signs of regret, or just the last echoes of lives built on fear and violence? Did any of them genuinely feel the weight of what they had done, or were their final moments just another twisted chapter in a darker story? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if these stories stayed with you, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Thanks for watching.